Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Sandell, and I work with the Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Master the Interview. The recording will be shared with all registrants in the next few days. Before I do the introduction, I just want to let you know that we're going to do a couple of polls so we can get some input from you. And of course, we're going to have a Q&A session. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Marie Segal. She's a career and leadership coach, author, and resume writer for attorneys, executives, and entrepreneurs. Her closest clients live less than a mile away from her, and her furthest lives in Sydney, Australia, which from her house is 9,955 miles away. Another lives in Singapore, a mere 9,500 miles away, and one is relocating from Venezuela. Marie has lived on the East Coast for 20 years, and she has a fun fact that's also related to President Obama. They both scooped ice cream as their first real job, which is really cool. Another interesting tidbit, and I love this, Marie's husband, well, this is not a good part, but Marie's husband had been laid off at one point. So as a lawyer, she bartered filing a trademark application for a career coach friend of hers in exchange for the friend coaching her husband. Marie's husband found a new job right away. Bingo, great. So she coached Marie instead. Marie was intrigued, then inspired, and later shadowed her friend as Marie prepared to make the switch. So we're very lucky that this serendipitous event happened so that we can have Marie speaking to us today. So as I mentioned, we're going to do a quick poll. Let me pull it up. And we want to know why you've joined the webinar. You're not required to answer, but I think it'll be useful. So we'll give you guys a couple of seconds more to answer. Great. So we'll share the results. So a little more than half of you are actively looking for work, and the others are considering a career move, but it's been a while since you've interviewed, and I get that. Another portion of you would be ready if a great opportunity came along, and wouldn't we all? I love that. I love that answer. Okay. So now I'll hand over the controls to Marie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Marie Segal. Can you all hear me? Lucy, you can monitor the chat box, right? Everyone saying yes, hopefully?
Yes, sorry, I had muted myself. Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. And maybe people could type in the chat box where they're calling in from so we could get a bit of an informal poll of that as well. That might be interesting to see if you can see each other on the box. So I'm Marie Segal. I graduated the University of Chicago in '96. I was getting a master's. I decided to move to the East Coast to go to law school, and I've been here ever since. So I lived in Chicago the first half of my life, the second half of my life. Now I'm here. We'll see what the future holds after that, but I'm pretty happy here in Connecticut. Happy to answer questions about relocating, obviously. So we're here for Mind Your Career, Master the Interview, Effective Strategy and Execution. I really want to emphasize those 2 points, strategy and execution. A lot of job seekers are very focused on the execution piece and not backing up enough to the strategy. And so that's a huge theme for today. If you remember anything else about this seminar, be strategic. And I'm going to read you a quote. This is not in the slides or the handouts. This is something from my book, but it's a quote from Seth Godin, whom many of us love. This is from his book, Linchpin. Seeing clearly means being able to do a job interview as though you weren't the interviewer or the applicant, but someone watching dispassionately from a third chair. As you know, Seth Godin is huge on disruption, Although my strategies here are not focused just on the startup community, and they're not really about everyone being disruptors in the way that we think now about the new economy, but they're applicable to that. And I bring up this quote because it's so important from the perspective of really thinking about how you do this. And this is the shift that I went through. I was telling Lucy before the call, I worked for a hedge fund before becoming a career coach when I was an attorney. It was actually a hedge and private equity fund. And what I learned there most of all was how to approach companies from that neutral third-party perspective, because I got to see the private equity owners, I got to see the C-level managers at those companies, and then the rank and file employees, if you will, and really get a broad perspective. So Seth's quote about you're not thinking just as the interviewer, you're not just trying to get into the interviewer's shoes, you're not just thinking about the interviewee yourself, but you're thinking about the entire situation and looking at it dispassionately and taking that passion away. And as an attorney for 15 years and in law school before that, that separating of emotion and reason is drilled into you, and you almost lose the emotion piece a bit and the emotional intelligence, which clearly is also important. But that very measured, reasoned approach is exactly what many job applicants are missing, because they get so caught up in the rush of, I have to apply somewhere, I have to get something, I only have 1 month or 6 months until, what do I do, falls into place. So let's try to step back from that and all be more strategic. So I'm going to get now into some of the details of the slides. And I will not be reading out slides. I don't believe in that. So please feel free to print out a copy of the slides later or now and read through them in more detail. But I am going to be going through the highlights. This is more about me, and I've told you about myself. I have also written a book called Master the Interview. That's the book I was quoting from. It's available on Amazon, and feel free to take a look at that as well. I also write for Forbes, so there's some articles up there if you'd like to read more on resumes or career topics. So interview strategy. The important thing about strategy is to start with intention, the right intention. So when I work with clients, and we're writing a resume, we're planning for the interview, the first thing we do is find out as much as we can about the company. This is number 2, the needs of the organization and role. What is the company looking for? What can you find in job descriptions, not just of the role that you're applying to, but other job descriptions? What can you find online through informational interviewing? And we'll go through that a little bit more. Really put yourself in the right headspace. Organize your job search. Organization is the second in these points. So again, this is the reason versus emotion. It really helps to have everything very organized. What I suggest is taking a folder with the name of the target on it. I'll use the word target for whatever company you're looking to interview with. The target's name on the folder, a new folder with all of your career documents for the next target, and so on. And if you are doing job searches in a couple of different areas, meaning, for example, if you are thinking of continuing as an attorney, but maybe also taking a business role, or if you are thinking of as a scientist looking at academia and industry, to take those folders with the targets and put them into themes and find different ways to organize yourself. It doesn't have to be the way I suggested, but it certainly should be one that works for you. The third piece here is interview performance. This is what we think about as the traditional crux of interviewing. This is being in the room, hopefully you're not sweating. You ask for a cup of coffee, you are performing right in the space at the time. And we'll go into that in more detail. And then follow up. The interview doesn't end the minute you walk out the door. And honestly, for networking and for interviewing, lack of follow-up is often where people get stuck. They either don't think they did well, or they don't know how to follow up, but for some reason they just kind of go dark. And if they go dark and the company goes dark, then there's no match at all. But certainly you should not be thinking, even if you interview for a job and you're rejected, you should not be taking that company off your list if it's someone that long-term you'd like to work for. I've seen many, many candidates and colleagues not get a position and then later be hired by the same company. So follow through is essential. So I say at all points in the process, focus on. I talked about number one, the needs of the organization and role, and we'll get into that in more detail. Also, your unique offer and your own needs. So what is your value proposition? And we'll talk about that further. And then what do you need to make that job work for you, and is there a match? So I also wanted to read, and I said I won't read all the slides through, but I wanted to make sure that you understand this slide, all the important 5 components to a successful interview. And so to some degree, this is chronological: pre-interview context and securing an interview, the company research, self-preparation, that's your value prop. And in the handout, there's a value proposition worksheet. So I suggest that you read through that. Interview performance and follow through. Before you interview, so we're in the stage of setting yourself up well for the interview. Many of you probably have social media presences already. You have a LinkedIn profile. You may be quoted in the press. You may have different aspects of your life made public online. You want to review all of this before you go out for a job interview and make sure that your brand, that word we talk about, personal branding, is consistent across your online presence, or to the extent that it's not, find some way to reconcile it to make it as consistent as possible. This doesn't mean that you can't do career transitions. It does mean that all of your current information should either be it doesn't have to be niched necessarily, but philosophically married to who you present yourself as. Or if you have, as I said, different lines that you're pursuing, how do you straddle those? How do you put them all together? That's something you should be thinking about strategically to prepare yourself for the interview. Networking. I don't know, everyone on the call here today, how many of you have really gotten into networking in the new way of thinking about networking? But this point at the bottom on the left-hand side of the slide, networking is not about a transaction, but about creating a meaningful relationship with another person. I gave a talk to the United Nations, I guess last month, and the person setting it up for me said, oh, you have to talk about networking because the people that are here, and these were a lot of people in Europe, they just feel like networking is a dirty word. You know, they don't want to do it. And the reason is because they've been networked to, not networked with. That's the way I would explain it. And if that's ever happened to you, and I'm sure it's happened to most, if not all of us, someone networking to you, meaning just to try to create a transaction, just to try to fill some short-term needs, that doesn't work. That's not the new theory of networking. That's not how we think about it today. It's creating a meaningful relationship. The same way that I spoke about you being, you applying to a job and maybe not being chosen for that role, but being able to work for the company later. The same idea applies with networking. And I'll give you a very personal example. I had a solo law practice for 2 years, and then I became and then worked in a law firm again for another year. And then I became a coach. And what I found very interesting is that the clients and referral sources for my law practice were the same clients and referral sources in large part for my coaching practice, because those were the relationships I maintained. If you're thinking about interviewing in the broader context, as I encourage you to do, think about creating meaningful relationships over the long term, because we all live in a world where, you know, some people still have jobs for 20 years, but many of us don't. So if you're not in the market in full force today, you may be in 2 or 3 years, and even if you are, I would say think of your next job as somewhere you'd like to stay at least 3 to 5 years. Because if you don't think you'll stay there 3 to 5 years, then it's not worth taking the job. But if you think about it as a 10 or 20-year endeavor, you will not be open to new opportunities. And the networking falls right into that new view of networking. Start with your end goal. What are you trying to achieve in your career? Who are the right people to carry you there and for you to really want to network with over the long term yourself, and what can you give back to them, and think about it in that larger context. Informational interviewing is a big part of interviews now. Not everyone has done this. If you haven't, Lucy mentioned that there was an entire webinar about informational interviewing prior, so I won't go into this in huge detail, but I'd like to at least talk about this point on the left about what you get out of informational interviewing. You can help yourself make transitions. You're moving out of your comfort zone. You're keeping current with trends. One career expert talks about informational interviewing as something you should be doing over your entire career, even if you're happy in your job. Just keeping yourself current with what's going on in the industry. Networking, obviously, and staying top of your game. So informationally interview when you're in your job search, before you're in your job search. In fact, those of you who are on the call and looking opportunistically, you're in a great place because you have no time pressure. So you can build these relationships, continue to water them, and let them grow. Those of you who are now in a rush of a job search, same idea. Think about that short-term next job, but also think about it over the long term. So now we're getting into the company research, and this is the capstone interview question. Why do you want to work here? I have a whole slide on this. In fact, I think I have two. Well, the second one relates to it as well. This is, if you don't get this one right, it's very unlikely that you will get the job. Let's just put it that fine of a point on it, because it's really so important. So many people that I've worked with, candidates or people I've met in the job search, it's like they're applying for so many jobs they don't even know why they'd want to work somewhere. Going back to that quote from Seth Godin, if you can take yourself dispassionately out of the interview context and watch yourself, you would realize how you must be presenting if someone asks you why you want to work here or asks you about the company and you don't even have a sense of it. What we do as candidates is we get so caught up in our own stuff. Our worries that we're good, we're not good enough for a role, what skills we bring to the table, and we forget often to really be thinking about what are they looking for. And in my last point, why is the role for which you are interviewing actually needed at the company? How would you benefit the company from joining? Really be thinking about this. We have a tendency as employees, people who've been employees their whole career, to just think that jobs are out there, they're created, and not always get into the depths of what does that role actually bring. And if you are thinking about benefits, you are ahead of the pack, and you will be, even for the most sophisticated interviewer, compelling as a candidate, because you're thinking, as they call it, thinking like an owner of the company. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. What benefit would you bring in the role, meaning what does the role add to the company, and then you specifically, and that goes into your value proposition. So this slide and the handouts have more things you should be asking about the company, but let's get to the value proposition, because again, this is really, really critical and super missed, let's say. It's something that people don't really think about, and this is something I champion over and over, this value proposition. Talent, interest, skills, marketplace. That's value proposition, the combination of those four things. And I want to get into them each a little bit, because I want to make sure you understand this as you're thinking about developing your personal value prop. Talents. So what are you inherently good at? Interest. What do you like to do? Skills. What have you learned to do? So these are different things. You might be very talented at something. For example, you might be very talented at public speaking, but you hate it. So then it's not an interest of yours. You might be very talented at public speaking, but you haven't done a lot of it. You'd be interested in doing more, but you don't have the skills to do it because you haven't worked on it enough. So that's maybe a way to differentiate those three things in your mind. And then the marketplace, what does the market need? So, we could all be sculptors or artists or scuba divers or chefs, whatever. But if there's not enough people wanting to buy whatever we're producing, we have to have really, really great talent, interest, and skills to find that little tiny marketplace that will support it. Or we need to be thinking about a broader marketplace and a broader understanding of our skills. So take a look at the value prop handouts. Think about core competencies, hard and soft skills. Think about your edge. Your edge is something that you bring specifically to a role that someone else might not have. It could be international experience, a foreign language. It could be some other specific skill that you have that is helpful in a role. It's not just a skill that you happen to have, but something that would actually benefit the company. And again, thinking about the benefits you can bring. I'm happy to answer more questions about value prop at the end. So let's move on specifically to the interview room. Now we're in the interview room. We're thinking, we're still, again, strategically, but we're thinking about execution, and we're thinking about what you do when you're there. So Q&A prep with stock answers is helpful, but it's not enough. And I was actually coaching a University of Chicago grad last night, talking about this very slide. I sent her a copy of the presentation, and she had an interview today in DC. We were talking about this exact thing because she said, oh, I hear this interviewer ask questions like, if friends said 3 adjectives about you, friends and colleagues, what would they be? And how do I answer that? And I told her what I'll tell you today, which is, you don't know which questions you're going to ask. So here's my slide about the questions. Right? You can prepare for stock questions. What are your weaknesses? Why did you leave your last job? What comp are you expecting? Tell me about yourself. Walk me through your resume. There's a list of stock questions. They're in my books. They're in other interviewing books. Those you can prepare for, but not all the curveballs. So the personality question, or this, if you had 29 days left to live, what would you do with your time? I don't want you to focus necessarily on any specific curveball question, but I want you to be thinking thematically. So we go back to this slide. How can your answer demonstrate your value proposition? So you don't know the questions they're going to ask, but you do know the answers that you want to give. And to some degree, many, many different questions can support a similar answer. So think about the themes in your career. What are your accomplishments? What have you done well? Think about examples that you can use over and over. As I said, think thematically, have versatile examples. You really want to have that value prop ready to go, and then you can answer to any question they might ask. So in the context of the person I was coaching last night, I said, okay, so think about this question here. Tell me about yourself. She said, well, should I say I'm from Chicago and I went to the University of Chicago and I majored in such and such at Chicago? And I said, is that the most compelling story about you? Does that relate to why you want to work for this individual? What about how you decided on your major? Because she has a very unique major. What about why you decided to move to DC? What about why you want to work for this individual? Can you work those themes into your answer? Because that's more interesting, frankly, than the Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. And you don't want to be redundant. And it's on your resume, so it's already there. Every question they ask, you want to reveal something about yourself that's maybe a bit personal, but certainly supports your professional value proposition, supports why you are the person they should hire. Always that question, why should we hire you, is the question behind every other question. So if you think about it that way, it makes these curveballs a little bit easier. And there are many, many different types of questions you could be asked. So here's some examples. Amazon, for example, I coach clients who want to get jobs at Amazon. Hypothetical and behavioral questions can stump you. You want to go on, Harvard site or probably the University. I haven't looked at the University of Chicago, but I'm assuming they'll have in their career center some as well. Lucy could mention later what resources they have. Case studies, a lot of jobs ask for that. McKinsey, as the consulting company, has some really good information on that. Personality tests, you may be asked. And then there are many types of interview formats nowadays. There's even video interviews. There are things where they make you turn off everything else on your computer and work on an assignment that they've given to you. You want to be ready for all the different types of formats. And as I say in this, at the top of this slide, a recruiter or someone in the industry, someone at the company, should be able to key you up for what you should be expected to ask, what you should expect that they'll ask. And honestly, if you're in a phone interview, have lots and lots of pieces of paper out in front of you with different potential answers. So someone I prepped for Amazon, for example, well, she said, well, I don't know what hypotheticals they can ask. And she had some ideas of some themes, and I said, well, write down everything that could possibly relate to a question you think they might ask. So, again, you don't know the questions, but you know what the answers can be. So this happened to be an attorney, and she was thinking that a lot of the questions would be around permitting. So I said, think of all the issues that can arise in permitting, getting permits from the government for different things. Because you know Amazon's moving out to bricks and mortar stores after they've killed them all off. It's ironic, and we could talk about it for a long time, but that's their business model. So what kind of permits would arise? So think about everything that could happen, try to prioritize them and have them ready for yourself so you're not stumped and saying, oh my God, I don't know how to answer this question. You have all the answers there in front of you already. And this goes into the performing in the interview slide, have a get unstuck plan if you become tongue-tied. I have had clients say they sat for what felt like 5 minutes without answering, and I'm sure it wasn't. It was probably 45 seconds, but embarrassed because they don't know what to say. They just can't think of an answer. You shouldn't fill the space with words. You should give yourself time to think of an answer, but you need to keep the conversation going. You need to have some kind of conversation filler. Whether it's, oh, that's a good question, let me think about that. There was a situation that came up, and then you can pause for a minute. The situation that came up, let me think. Right, we dealt with that at such and such company that you worked for. You're talking yourself and your interviewer through the answer. Also in this slide, read everything in this slide, and there's more in my book about how to really think about the interview, again, in this expanded context. But some things that I really want to make sure you get out of this slide. Consider it a meeting of colleagues, even if not as equals. It's not an interrogation. If you treat a job interview like an interrogation, that's what you'll get. You really need to be thinking about it as you're meeting them where they are. So the same way that you would be talking to someone once you're working there and have that open interaction. I mean, not that you're oversharing, not that you're getting off point, the things I talk about in the connect with the interviewer bullet point here, but a conversation amongst colleagues, not an interrogation. A really important point to be thinking about when you walk into the interview, and it may help calm some nerves if you're of two minds about how to present yourself or overly anxious about an interview. Make eye contact, watch your body language, don't squirm in the chair if there's a question you don't like, especially being ready for the types of questions that come up, like why you left your last job. If that was not a good parting, you need to be thinking about already how you're going to answer it. My stock advice, because that's about all we can have time for here, is give one or two sentences, matter-of-factly explaining, if there's a bad result that you need to talk about, one or two sentences, matter-of-factly, and then spin it. So, for example, it was not a good personality match. I didn't realize at the time, and then maybe give one small detail without disparaging the company. And then you spin it, meaning, and what I learned from that is, and why I'm glad to be interviewing here is, or something that both propels the conversation forward and shows that you learn from the experience, because it's not just about failure, it's about how you deal with failure. So if you're thinking, I was fired, I'm a failure, I can tell you my husband was fired twice. He was fired in '08, his whole group was let off over a certain level, and then others were moved, but basically he was on the job market. And then again, he left a very comfy job for a risky startup, and it didn't work out, and he had to bounce again. Now he's at MasterCard, and he's very happy. So it's not a failure, it's a learning experience. Think about everything in your career that way, and it will help you perform in the interview. Do you have any questions for me? Again, a crucial point in interviewing. Your questions from the interview for the interviewer can make or break an interview. They need to demonstrate these 4 points: that you're interested and curious about the company, that you've done your diligence, that you understand what point in the process you are at. Sorry to use a preposition at the end with the University of Chicago audience, but I do sometimes. That you understand where you are in the process. You're not asking questions too early, and you have appropriate deference for the interviewer. That does not mean that you don't push or be assertive at times. That's appropriate, but you have to be thinking about whether this is one of those times. And you need to show a logical thought process. So what I mean by that last point is you don't want to ask questions that are not well thought out. If you're asking a question that you're kind of hedging and you're not really sure how to say it, or that's not the right question. You need to be performing the way you would perform on the job when you ask these questions. You need to be able to have them visualize you in front of their clients, in front of their board of directors, in front of their boss, in front of them when they're on a busy day, asking questions in a succinct manner, the same as they would expect you to do when you're at the job. So you're performing with these follow-up questions. You want to plan a couple of them. Some more may come up as you're in the interview. You might want to take a note or two for yourself. But again, be thinking about very well thought out questions. And don't ask way too many, because that will just annoy people. That's the appropriate timing and deference piece. You ask 2 or 3 and you save the rest. Don't be afraid to raise concerns, pose them thoughtfully. Think about your leverage. Think about your gut. What's it telling you? You know, our second brain, as they say. And how you can get information. It's not just from the interviewer, unless it's a very unique situation. And then negativity. It's the greatest interview killer. I'm going to share a story about myself. I actually flew back Monday from California, and I got sick. And so yesterday I spent most of the day recovering. Today I woke up, I thought, oh my God, I've got this webinar to give. I'm not feeling it. So about half an hour ago, I started playing the music I love and doing some jumping jacks and the like. And if you don't feel good on your interview day, you can get yourself to feel good by the time you're there, because now I'm very happy and I'm focused and I'm here and I'm ready. And you need to find a way to do that. So whatever the negativity is, if it's something like I just described, or if it is, you know, bad feelings about your old job or how long you've been on the market, you need to find some other outlet for that. Maybe a career coach, I get a lot of that. I absorb a lot of that negativity for people, or help reframe and redirect it. But however you do it, you need to get it out before you get into the room, because they can smell it, you know. It's so obvious. Going again back to that Seth Godin quote at the beginning. Imagine you're watching yourself in the interview. How are you coming across? Think about it that way. And frankly, you can practice beforehand. I use voice memos a lot to practice things. You can videotape yourself. You can practice with a friend. You can practice with a coach. You can find ways to see how you're coming across, which questions are throwing you. Follow through. The last point I want to make is about how to follow through after the interview. So hopefully you can get some guidance while you're in the interview. you want to make sure you're following up with the right person and maybe a contact on the inside, although you don't want to nag. You don't want to come across as a nag. And so I give some guidance here. If there's no guidance, you know, sometimes this is just a general guideline. Sometimes you have to follow up very quickly because you know the job is about to be filled. Sometimes you know that this company is notorious for taking a very long time, but you want to stay front of mind. And this middle point here about updates that do not require a response, I love this idea. I got this from Kelly Hoey, who wrote Build Your Dream Network, a former colleague of mine from White and Case. She was talking about the startup community and having people invest in your company, and how you have to stay front of mind because you don't know when they're going to finally make the offer, which is the same as a job offer. But you need to stay front of mind without pestering. So how do you do that? You update them where you are, that you're still interested, that sort of thing, without asking questions or putting it in a way that requires them to respond. So they see your email, they don't respond to you. That's actually a good thing. Many of us get nervous when we don't get a response because we think people aren't reading our emails, they aren't listening to us, but everybody's very busy. You put out there, and that's sometimes enough. The interview debrief is another handout that I have. I suggest whether you use my form or your own or just a blank piece of paper, debrief yourself, because you will be surprised how much you can forget from the day of or after the interview to 3 to 6 months later, and they may call you at any time. If you have that form, especially if you can scan it to yourself and have it readily available, you will look on top of your game in a way that will be shocking to them. You'll remember details from the conversation. Last and final point, keep interviewing elsewhere until the deal is sealed, and that means in writing, signed, sealed, and delivered, because things do fall through. So I wish you the best of luck with all your job search. Everyone, hopefully there are some questions. If there's not, I can certainly talk some more. We'll fill up the hour. Please stay on the line, and let's have Lucy. Lucy, if you're here, you can break in now and tell me what's been going on. Thanks.
Sure. Well, great. Unfortunately, people can't see what other people are asking for the questions. In a way, it's good for me because then I know at least they're paying attention to you. But to your first question, where people were calling from or dialing in from, we got people from Chicago, LA, Houston, I may not be pronouncing this right, Cupertino, California, Denver, Milwaukee, Philly, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, New York City, St. Petersburg, Florida. So that's what I love about these. Oh, Madrid. That's what I love about these webinars, that we attract people from all over the place. So Anne-Marie mentioned, and I just want to direct your vision over to the panel. There are handouts that Anne-Marie has provided for us, so you can detach them and then save them to your computer. That would be great. And we're going to do a quick poll before we get to the questions. It's about your least favorite interview question. I think all of us have had at least one or sometimes all of these questions. So do you want to start voting? Couple more seconds. Okay, we're going to close it and we're going to share the results. Okay, what's your greatest weakness? Yeah, I hate that one too. Mine are Cheetos. If I've absolutely, I mean, that's the silly answer, but just wave a bag in front of me and I'm gone. So that's great. That's great that people are responding. I like that 89% of the people attending this webinar responded. So that's great, because that means that people are still listening. So the
So I
first,
can speak.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I can speak to this. What is your greatest weakness? Because I go into some detail about this question in the book, and it's interesting because one of the reasons I wrote the book, and Lucy, you were asking me about this before, is because I was frustrated with what was out there. I was telling clients would say to me, "What book should I read?" And one of them even said to me, "I have your book," which was another author, "and your book said such and such, and do you agree with it?" And I thought, I have to write my own book because I was not liking the answers that were given. So one of the things I did in my book was I talked about greatest weaknesses in a lot of detail with a lot of different examples, because I don't like this cookie cutter answer idea at all. I don't think it's helpful. And as people associated with or grads from the University of Chicago, we all understand what that means. So what is your greatest weakness? One point of advice I really want to give on this is every possible personality trait, everything about you is either a strength or a weakness and can be both, right? So I talk to candidates who've been at a job for 20 years, and I talk to candidates who have a new job every 2 years. Both of those are strengths and weaknesses, for example. They may not be your greatest strength or weakness, but just to use a very clear example, everything about you, if you're very niched, it can be a strength or a weakness. If you're a generalist, it can be a strength or a weakness. So part of it is, again, removing that emotion about the weaknesses point. And, you know, every interview book will say, spin your weakness into a strength, which is true. You do need to be really thinking about it as far as not just making it a strength. I'm a perfectionist, you know, that's the standard, right? And that's one I suggest people don't even use anymore because it's so over. It's like, why are we even having this conversation? I suggest people who are interviewers don't use the greatest weaknesses question because it's so over prepared and you don't really get anything good out of it. So that's my input on weakness. If you have other things, Lucy, or did you want me to address some of these other questions here?
Oh, we have questions that people have typed in.
Sure.
So that's great. Yes, I mean, obviously, if somebody asks you a question, right, what's your greatest weakness, then you have to respond. The first question that came up is, do you have any suggestions for a mid-year professional? This person has a UChicago MBA in finance, who's been out of the workforce for about a year and would like to target part-time professional roles when almost 99% of the job openings in the city are only full-time. They're looking, sorry, it was just a little bit more. She would perhaps like to transition back to full-time, but for now, for personal reasons, looking for part-time.
Mm-hmm. So this is part of why I talked about networking a bit at the beginning and how important networking is to the job search, because I would say, without knowing this individual, it's very likely that she will have much less success going through what I call the black hole, the online job submission process, just because very few part-time jobs are offered, and when they are, they're often not advertised. It's kind of, everybody wants them, and very few companies want to offer them. So what I suggest is that she does one of a couple of things. Reach out to her network and try to find ways in that way, because those people, she's already a credible candidate to those individuals. She's not just a piece of paper and a list of credentials. So networking is hugely important. Maybe she's also already doing this, but consulting and finding consulting gigs that can either lead to a part-time job or frankly create her own job. If she has the appetite for it and has some entrepreneurial nature, again, interest and talent, not necessarily skill as an entrepreneur yet, she could consider thinking about consulting as well.
Great. Oh, we also have someone from Greece and someone from San Francisco. Can you please talk about how to ace the interview when trying to make a career transition? A person's going from lab management and wants to go into development.
Okay, so the first thing, again, and this goes back to something I talked about as well, researching the company. One of the hurdles that you face is really understanding the role that you're getting into. So you said lab management versus development. You want to be doing two things. First of all, showing your transferable skills, showing what you've done in your prior role that relates to your new role. So if you look at my LinkedIn profile, for example, I went back and revamped what I did when I was at the hedge and private equity fund to relate to what I do now as a coach. So I did a lot of recruiting. I worked with people cross-functionally. You can see more if you wanted to go look at it. I'm just at Marie Segal, linkedin.com/in or /Marie Segal, if you wanted to look at it as an example. So recasting what you've done already in the context of what they'll want from you, why they'll hire you in the future. And then really understanding the new role, being able to speak to what happens in that role. You'll get that from informational interviewing, and you'll also get it from doing research on the company, as I mentioned. So the reason it's hard to get from point A to point B is because, first of all, people don't see you in the new light. And second of all, everyone is pretty risk averse in hiring. They don't want to take a chance on you and be wrong. It's better to take a chance on somebody who's a known quantity than to take a chance on somebody who's a little risky. And so you need to go that extra mile. Networking is also really important to help you with your transition. Hopefully that's helpful.
It's great. It's almost as if you read the second part of this participant's question, so that's good to know. The next question is, what is the appropriate level to convey your interest in a role? Obviously, it's important to let them know that you understand and really want the role, but what is the proper balance between I'm desperate for this and I think this would be a cool job to have?
Got it. So if I go back to a prior slide, here, think about your leverage is an important place to start. So nobody should ever be desperate for a job, so let's just start there. You know, you don't want to be the kid who's got patent leather shoes on, you know, and is like all super excited and, oh my God, you know, I'll work for free, I'll lick the floors, you know, if you hire me. Certainly don't want to be that person. And you don't want to be cool either. So right above where I just read in this slide, I was talking to a candidate, again, it was this week, I think, about how to delicately pose the question about compensation adjustments. He's moving from a low rent or a medium rent real estate market to a hot job market, you know, a la Cupertino or the like, that city, a suburb of Palo Alto. Okay, so, you know, you can pose that question right away. You can sound, you know, like you want an answer immediately, or you can be a little cool and hold back. Say, well, let's see what they have to offer me. I'll just keep going along, and then see what happens and ask the question at the end. And so I would not give the same answer to every individual. I would say you need to be thinking about where you actually are authentically in your life professionally at this time, in your life personally at this time. And so you want to show as much enthusiasm as you can realistically without overwhelming them. And frankly, honestly, it also depends on what level you're at, how you can do this. Because if you are at a very, very high level, you can say, okay, so it looks like we're a great match, let's get this done. I mean, not necessarily using those words, but that's the approach you might take. And the idea is we're all busy here. Let's either move forward or move on. That's something that in some cases is very appropriate. Also, as a junior person, you could be very, very enthusiastic about something. I warn people when they write cover letters, for example, not to use basically words that look like exclamation points and lots of flowery adjectives about how super enthusiastic and excited they are, because I think it turns people off. So you want to achieve a healthy balance, but you certainly don't want to be cruel to the point where they say, if we gave her a job offer, we're not even sure she would take it. This other person sounds much more interested. Because I, again, have been on the other side of the interviewing table when we've had two candidates matched up against each other, and honestly, showing genuine enthusiasm for the job really does make a difference.
Great. How does this person apply for a position for which they don't have the required skills, especially skills that you can only acquire by working in a job, not through a course or class?
Right. So there are a couple of points on that question. One is you really need to be taking a long-term or big picture look at the job description. Sometimes job descriptions are written that are basically a recitation of what the old person in the job did. So they don't necessarily even match up to what's in the job. So when you say job requirements, I assume you're referencing the job description. And if that's the case, take it with a grain of salt. In fact, it's an interesting statistic, and I don't know the source, but I've heard that men apply for things when they meet 70% of the job criteria, and women when they meet 100, which is clearly a stereotype, but it's an interesting data point anyway. And whether you happen to be the man or the woman in that example, or someone who maybe is switched from the gender stereotyping, the idea is some people say, oh yeah, I can do that job, and they'll apply for it, and other people are making sure that they match up to everything. And then there's a third category of people, and I've had to talk candidates out of this, but they really don't match up to anything, don't even have an interest in the job, but they're just applying because they feel like papering their resume out there will somehow work for them, which doesn't. So I would say, same as I said to a prior individual with a question, see what you can learn, the person moving into the development space, see what you can learn on your own through informational interviewing so that you can show a capacity and aptitude for whatever they're doing. And certainly you can't get the experience without being there, then there's nothing you can do to fix that. But you can at least understand what they're doing. Because, for example, someone who has a mergers and acquisitions, M&A background, who wants to get into private equity. So have you done private equity before? No, but I've done mergers and acquisitions, which are very akin to private equity, and here's why. That's a great answer. Because it shows that you are thinking about the skill set and not just what's specific to that job. The same would be if you knew one computer language and you were being asked to program in another one. What you need to show is the aptitude. You need to show that you can hit the ground running and be able to do what they're asking to do, even if you don't have those specific skills that they're asking for. You have the talents and the interest and the transferable skills.
Love that answer. Next question. How do I explain my time away from work? I'm a stay-at-home parent for 8 years. Do I volunteer this information during the interview? I don't want them guessing about why I've been away from the field.
Okay. So this is again an answer that can be very specific to the candidate, so it's hard to answer more generally. But with that caveat in mind, here's what I would say. Presenting yourself on the resume and then LinkedIn, as I talked about here, is really the first offense, if not line of defense, as far as thinking about how to present yourself, and so it needs to be consistent with that. So some things that people do, for example, is they call themselves Chief Executive Officer of, if it were me, the Segal household, or something similar to that. And there's a lot of information online. There are rebounding coaches, and there are people offering internships for someone onboarding, again, to the job market. Where I am, Pace University, for example, in Westchester nearby me, has a whole program around this. So in some contexts, you can be very out there about it and upfront about it because it's really the program. I also have a client, for example, who is a lawyer and an MBA and worked for a long time, and now she's done, since things been out of it with aging parents, and she's actually coming back in and offering this as another skill set. She's a seasoned individual. She's looking to now move into the nonprofit space. And so the nonprofit space, it's very different than in the corporate world because they value the whole person in a very different way. And again, I'm generalizing because of our short time here, but those are some thoughts about how to present it. Now, your specific question of should I offer that in the job interview, it's very likely you'll be asked about it. I would probably wait to be asked about it, but again, it depends on what you're applying for, what you did before, whether you've kept your skills current, which I suggest if you haven't, you find a way to do now, whether you're transitioning, there are a whole bunch of things, but you should definitely have your answer. And it's the same type of thing as I said before, to have 1 or 2 sentences. So whether your kids had special needs or something that kept you home, or you just want, not that you necessarily reference that, but you know, I needed or wanted to give this time to my family, and I felt it was important, and I'm so glad I did it. And now I'm ready to, and then you're positioning yourself. I'm ready to move back full time, and I'm so excited. And and then you talk about why or what you're wanting to offer in the next role. So you're spinning it.
Great. We have a lot of questions. I don't know if you have a hard cutoff at 1 p.m. Central, or can you take a few more questions?
Sure, I can take a few more questions.
Great, thanks. A question about networking. It seems that networking varies from company to company. For example, corporate firms understand it more clearly and are always open to meeting, but higher ed networking is not very straightforward. Sometimes they get the sense that people are adverse to it. Your thoughts?
Got it. Okay. So higher ed. So assumingly this is not professorships, but positions in higher ed administration. Was it clear from the question?
Not completely. Okay. Do you want to jump in and ask the question? And we'll jump to, oh my gosh. Oh, sorry, higher ed administration. Great.
Okay, great. So I've actually advised a few clients who are in that field or looking to move to that field, and I agree that it's difficult to network in that space at times. Part of it is because the individuals in that space, they're not necessarily as used to looking at networking as benefiting them, right? So they're not as forward thinking about networking. So here's some suggestions. There are a number of organizations in higher ed. I actually even have, and I don't think it's public, I think it's in my client portal, but I have this person can email me. I have a list of organizations related to higher ed administration that I can send out. I would suggest that you start there, somewhere like that, getting into those organizations that are specific to that, because people are there to network, and so you can start to build up your network that way. And every time you do network, you can ask who else they believe you would be a good match for, or who else you could speak to. Certainly not networking to get a job, right? So you don't take an informational interview and then try to pump the person for a job. If they think you're going to be a good match for a job that they know or could create, they will put you up for it. They need to be able to trust you that you're really there to get information if that's what you say you're doing. So some of it, I don't know this candidate, but some of it is just making sure that you have the right intention. That one of the first words I talked about in these slides when you go into the process, not scaring people off with your networking efforts, making sure that you use the channels that people like. Some people, for example, will connect with someone on LinkedIn and then send notes on LinkedIn and want to know why they're not getting responses, because the other person isn't really a, quote, LinkedIn person. They're not active on LinkedIn. They would rather email. Some people like calls. Some people hate calls and certainly hate voicemails, because then you actually have to pick up the phone and call a person back. So think about the channel that you're networking through as well. So in other words, think more generally about what are the right networking strategies for that group. Think about what are the venues I would say fish where the fish are. So where are those people hanging out professionally or personally, and how do you get to them? And then honestly, I assume you're a Chicago grad. You might have had, some other school that you're from as well. Start thinking about connecting within those schools. Build yourself up as a thought leader if it's appropriate. I don't know what your transition timeline is, but think about what you can give to this space. So when you're networking with someone, for example, is there articles that might be relevant to the individual? You could send them over. If they're not something that everybody gets, right? But something that you've specifically picked out for that individual to try to help them be informed about a topic that they've expressed an interest in. That sort of thing. Creative ways to network to find it. Because your question is more general about this idea of networks that are more impenetrable. One last point I want to make is when you're networking, you have to be thinking about whether the individual you're trying to network with, as I said, not networking to, but networking with as far as building a relationship, is open to networking, because some people just aren't. And you have to, you don't necessarily stop and move on, but you have to take the arrows in your quiver and shoot at things that you think you're actually going to hit, right? Or maybe that's too violent of an analogy, but you want to take your networking energy and use it in a way that's actually helpful and useful, and not just expend it and then run out and burn out. So you want to network with people that you think are going to be receptive and create that longer term relationship with you.
Oops, I had to mute myself, sorry. We have so many questions, but I think to be courteous of your time, we're just going to do 2 more, and if the people who have questions who are still on the line, if you wouldn't mind just emailing them to me, because I can't pull them off the screen that easily. It would be copy and paste, and then I wouldn't know who asked the question. You can follow up afterwards. So the last 2 questions. How can you best market yourself and frame your resume if you have skills in very different careers? The person is a licensed attorney, higher education administrator, and realtor. The LinkedIn profile primarily focuses on higher education.
Okay. So, wow, that's a huge straddle in a way. And one of the things I would say is, I think those 3 might be too many. So I would probably eliminate one if possible. So I'll try to be judicious with time in the answer, but I'll talk about how to think about this and how to frame this. So you want to be very clear on your brand. In other words, you want to connect the dots for people. You don't want them to have to connect the dots, because frankly, anytime you ask your audience to work, you have the potential of losing them. So you want to do the work for them. So you say licensed attorney, higher ed administration, and also real estate. And I guess that's a real estate agent or real estate professional. As a real estate agent, do you need LinkedIn in order to get clients? Are you somehow using the real estate as part of what you offer in these other 2 roles? For example, are you a real estate attorney and a real estate agent, and you're looking to work for universities who might be currently expanding and using those real estate skills? Would that be something at all applicable? If it is, maybe, it's not too far afield, but probably it is too far afield, and probably you dropped the real estate piece from your LinkedIn and your resume, although you could put a line or 2. So when I say drop it, I mean from the summary. You could put something further below, because LinkedIn doesn't have a space limit. And you could put a licensed real estate line and additional information on your resume, for example. When you're thinking about it for the interview, again, I would only talk about it to the extent it's relevant, because you have to serve the meal that people want to eat. If your interviewer is vegan, you know, you don't serve steak. Basically, that's the crux of it.
Great. And last question, can you speak to when an interviewer asks you if you're applying elsewhere? Ooh. Is it appropriate to name drop other companies you're applying for, or would you make it seem as if you're fairly committed to the role that that interviewer's offering?
Right. It's an interesting question. Again, it's situationally dependent. It depends on, you know, basically how aggressively that question is asked. So sometimes it may be appropriate to name drop, although my instinct is that generally it's not. You might say the usual suspects. So for example, if you're interviewing in San Francisco, and you know, we all know who the big names are there, or Seattle or some other market, you could say, you know, the usual suspects. They might push you, and you know, you might drop a name or two, but frankly, I would say I would hold my cards a little closer to the vest. You do want them to know you're interviewing other places if in fact you are potentially expecting an offer soon, or if you are very much more interested in another organization and wanting to push them a little bit. So in other words, thinking again about the, it's the slide I have open right now, you know, what are your alternatives? What do your guts tell you? What are the supply and demand for someone with your skills? It's the interview, and this is a general thought about the interview process, the delicate dance. It's often like dating. In fact, the person with the example I gave on this slide, I said this to that person as well. It's like dating. You know, you can't talk about marriage until you talk about, you know, that you go through the first few dates. It's the same idea here. When do you reveal your cards? You really have to just, you know, the Seth Godin thing. Think about someone third party watching you. What does it look like in that space at that moment? What's your best strategy in that moment based on the posture that you're in? And I don't mean posture like sitting in the chair, but, you know, in the sense of where are you in the interview process? Is this the first interview or the third interview? And why do you think they're asking the question? Are they getting ready to make you an offer? Are they trying to figure out if you're a serious candidate or you're just a dilettante interviewing around? And what did you say? Did you say you were interviewing opportunistically, that you're not really looking to move? But then they ask you where else you're interviewing and you give them 3 names, then that you lost credibility. So all of these questions are an it depends answer. And there's some of the thoughts that you should have as you're trying to figure out how you should approach it strategically.
Well, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. It's been really wonderful, and thank you for going almost 10 minutes over. We really appreciate that. And I feel badly that we couldn't get to all the questions, but as I said, I'm going to be sending out the link to the recording for everybody, the slides. You've got access to the handouts, and if you want to send me questions, I'd be happy to share them with Anne-Marie as appropriate.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. For those of you who are in the law field and or life sciences, we're going to be doing another webinar on May 30th. It's not going to be recorded, so this one you have to come in live, but it's going to be about the healthcare system and legal and regulatory issues around there. So it should be a lively discussion. Again, thank you all for participating. Thank you, Anne-Marie. You were wonderful. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and sharing it with us. Okay, everybody, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Lucy.